Welcome, dear listener, to a tale woven from silver and shadow, from ancient stone and whispered secrets. Tonight, as the world grows quiet around you, let us journey together into the hidden history of one of the wizarding world's most enigmatic families. Settle yourself comfortably, allow your breathing to slow and deepen, and let the gentle rhythm of this story carry you toward peaceful rest. We begin our tale not in the England you might expect, but across the sea, in the misted valleys and moonlit forests of medieval France, where magic was old and names carried weight like crowns. Close your eyes, if you wish, and let us drift backward through time to where all Malfoy stories truly begin. In the rolling countryside of Normandy, in an age when castles rose like stone dreams against grey skies, there lived a family whose name would echo through centuries of magical history. The Malfoys, or as they were known in their native tongue, the Malfoy family. A name that whispered of bad faith, though they themselves would tell you it spoke of fierce independence and cunning wisdom. Long before the first stones of Hogwarts were laid, before the statute of secrecy drew its invisible curtain between magical and muggle worlds, the Malfoy family practiced their arts in the shadows of French oak forests and in chambers lit by floating candles that never guttered in any wind. They were not the most powerful magical family in France, but they possessed something perhaps more valuable: an instinct for survival, an understanding of when to reveal their abilities and when to keep them hidden like jewels in velvet boxes. While other magical families flaunted their power and drew unwanted attention, the early Malfoys moved quietly among both magical and non-magical nobility, accumulating wealth and influence with the patience of spiders spinning webs in the corners of great halls. The family's patriarch in those distant days was Armand Malfoy, a wizard of considerable talent whose silver blonde hair caught the light like polished platinum, even in the dimmest chambers. Armand had inherited not only magical ability from his ancestors, but also a sharp mind for politics and an even sharper eye for opportunity. He served in the court of Duke William of Normandy, offering counsel that seemed to come from natural wisdom, but was often enhanced by subtle charms and divination rituals performed in secret. When William looked across the channel toward England with ambitious eyes, Armand Malfoy saw not just a military campaign, but a doorway to a new world of possibilities. The year 1066 shimmers in history like a turning point written in starlight, and for the Malfoy family, it was precisely that. When William the Conqueror assembled his fleet to cross the English Channel, among his most trusted advisors sailed Armand Malfoy, his wife Marguerite, and their 3 children. While other families remained in France, clinging to familiar lands and established power, Armand understood that those who sailed with William into uncertainty would be rewarded with certainty beyond measure. The crossing was treacherous, as all great journeys are. Storms churned the grey waters, and ships rocked like cradles in the hands of angry giants. But Armand stood at the prow of his vessel, his wand concealed beneath his Norman cloak, whispering weather charms passed down through generations, easing the winds just enough to keep his family safe. He did not calm the entire fleet, that would have drawn too much attention, but he protected what was his, as Malfoys always would. England, when they finally reached its shores, was a land of ancient magic quite different from what they had known in France. The very earth seemed to hum with older enchantments, stones that remembered giant builders, forests where creatures of legend still wandered in the mists. Armand felt it the moment his boots touched English soil. This was a land where magic ran deeper, wilder, less tamed by wizarding society. It was perfect. When William achieved his conquest and began parceling out English lands to his Norman supporters, Armand Malfoy made his request with characteristic precision. He did not ask for the largest estates or the most strategically valuable castles. Instead, he requested lands in Wiltshire, in the green and gentle south, where ancient ley lines converged and where, he had learned through careful research, magical families had dwelt since before Roman times. The land he chose was rich and beautiful, rolling hills dotted with ancient barrows where old magic slept, and forests thick with trees that had witnessed centuries pass like seasons. There, on a rise that commanded views across the countryside, Armand Malfoy began to build what would become the legendary Malfoy Manor. The construction took years, for it was not merely a house, but a statement, a fortress, a magical sanctuary woven into the very fabric of English earth. Norman stonemasons, both magical and non-magical, laboured under Armand's exacting direction. But at night, when the Muggle workers had retired, Armand and carefully selected magical architects worked spells into the foundations, enchantments that would protect the house through centuries of change, that would make it unplottable to those not invited, that would cause any with ill intent to suddenly remember urgent business elsewhere. The manor rose in pale stone, its architecture speaking of Norman elegance, but adapted to English climate and customs. Tall windows let in the gentle English light, but could be shuttered and shielded with charms against any threat. Gardens were planted with both common English flowers and rare magical plants brought carefully from France in spelled containers, gillyweed from coastal pools, dittany for healing, and moonflowers that bloomed only under full moons and sang lullabies in forgotten languages. In the cellars, Armand constructed vaults where the family's treasures and secrets could be kept safe from the passing centuries, locked with magic that recognized only Malfoy blood. As the manor took shape, so too did the Malfoy family's place in English society. Armand was careful, always careful, to walk the line between magical and Muggle worlds. To their non-magical neighbours and to William's court, the Malfoys appeared as wealthy Norman nobles, their prosperity attributed to wise investments and favourable royal connections. But in the hidden magical communities of England, in the taverns that appeared only to those who knew the right words, in the forest clearings where witches and wizards gathered to trade spells and news, the Malfoy name began to carry a different kind of weight. Armand understood something that many pure-blood families of the time did not, that isolation meant stagnation. He welcomed magical families to his home, hosted gatherings where knowledge was exchanged like currency, and built alliances that would serve his descendants for generations. He was particularly interested in families with ancient lineages, those who could trace their magic back beyond memory, for he wished the Malfoy name to be associated not just with wealth and power, but with magical heritage of the deepest kind. It was during this time that the Malfoy family began to cultivate their particular philosophy regarding blood purity. Armand had observed how magical ability sometimes diluted when wizarding families married Muggles, though he was pragmatic enough to acknowledge that talent could appear from unexpected sources. Still, he believed that magical bloodlines, when carefully maintained, produced the most powerful and gifted wizards. This belief, passed down through careful instruction to his children, would become a cornerstone of Malfoy family identity, a belief that would bring them both great influence and, centuries later, great peril. The Malfoy children grew to adulthood in their English home, raised with the best of both Norman and English traditions. They learned French and English, studied both Muggle politics and magical arts, and were taught from earliest childhood that they were special, chosen, part of an elite that had the wisdom and ability to shape the world around them. They learned to wear their pride like an invisible crown, to move through the world with the confidence of those who knew their place was at the top. Young Lucian Malfoy, Armand's eldest son and heir, proved particularly adept at learning his father's lessons. He mastered subtle magic before he could properly tie his boots, could charm a room full of nobles before he turned 12, and understood instinctively how to accumulate power without appearing to grasp for it. When Armand finally passed peacefully in his sleep at the age of 87, a remarkable age for the time, extended no doubt by carefully brewed potions and health charms, Lucian took up the family mantle without missing a single step. Under Lucian's stewardship, Malfoy Manor became not just a home, but an institution. The family's wealth grew through shrewd investments in both Muggle and magical ventures, land holdings, trade routes, and discreet loans to both wizarding families and Muggle lords who never quite understood why their fortunes always seemed to improve after consulting with the Malfoys. The family's collection of magical artifacts expanded as well, for Lucian had inherited his father's fascination with objects of power, wands from legendary wand makers, books of spells from before the time of Merlin, enchanted mirrors that could show glimpses of possible futures, all found their way into the Malfoy vaults, acquired through purchase, trade, or occasionally through means that were never quite specified. The manor itself grew with the family's fortunes. Wings were added, towers rose, and gardens expanded to include a hedge maze that rearranged itself at midnight, and topiary creatures that could move from one position to another when no one was watching. The interior filled with treasures, tapestries that depicted the family's history, and that updated themselves as new events occurred. Portraits of ancestors that could converse with the living and offer advice, though always in riddles, as ancestor portraits tended to do, and furniture that had been spelled to never wear, never fade, to remain as perfect as the day it was crafted. Generations passed like pages turning in an ancient book. Each Malfoy heir added something to the family's legacy, sometimes wealth, sometimes knowledge, sometimes simply the wisdom to preserve what had been built. They navigated the changing landscape of English history with the same cunning that had brought Armand across the Channel. When King John clashed with his barons, the Malfoys carefully supported both sides, ensuring they would be on the winning side, regardless of outcome. When the Black Death swept through England, killing Muggles and wizards alike, the Malfoys retreated behind the protective enchantments of their manor and emerged unscathed when the plague finally passed. Through it all, the family maintained their commitment to blood purity, though they defined it in their own particular way. They married other old magical families, the Blacks, the Bulstrodes, the Lestranges, creating a web of connection that bound together the most ancient and powerful names in British wizarding society. These were not love matches, typically, though affection sometimes grew in time. They were strategic alliances, the joining of bloodlines and fortunes, the strengthening of magical heritage through careful selection. Yet despite their pride and their prejudices, the Malfoys were not without their complexities. In their private moments, in the quiet of the manor's ancient library, where moonlight fell through tall windows onto shelves of leather-bound books, they were capable of surprising depths. A Malfoy father reading bedtime stories to his daughter, tales of heroes and magic that made her eyes shine with wonder. A Malfoy mother tending personally to a house elf, injured in an accident, her healing spells gentle and sure. These moments existed alongside the pride and ambition, suggesting that beneath the polished surface of aristocratic perfection lay something more human, more vulnerable. The family's relationship with power was complex as well. They sought it, certainly, accumulated it, like dragons hoarding gold. But they were rarely interested in being at the very center of attention. The Malfoys preferred to be the whisper in the ear of those who sat on thrones, the advisors whose counsel shaped decisions, the benefactors whose support could make or break a political career. They understood that those who appeared to have all the power often fell the hardest when the wheel of fortune turned, but those who wielded influence from the shadows could weather any storm. As the centuries rolled onward and the manor's walls absorbed the echoes of countless conversations, celebrations, and quiet family moments, the Malfoy name became synonymous with a particular kind of magical aristocracy. They were the example other pure-blood families looked to, the standard by which success and proper wizarding behavior was measured. They hosted glittering parties in the manor's ballroom, where enchanted instruments played themselves and champagne flutes refilled with a gesture. They sat on the boards of magical institutions, their donations funding everything from St. Mungo's Hospital to the early development of what would become the Ministry of Magic. But there was always a shadow at the edge of all that light, a darkness that the family seemed unable or unwilling to fully shake. Their fascination with powerful magic sometimes led them towards spells that decent wizards avoided. Their collection of dark artifacts grew alongside their collection of benign treasures. Their pride in blood purity occasionally manifested in disdain for those they considered beneath them. Muggles certainly, but also Muggle-born wizards, half-bloods, and any who did not share their particular views on magical heritage. This duality, this tension between respectability and darkness, between public virtue and private moral flexibility, would define the Malfoy family through all the generations to come. They were never quite villains, but rarely quite heroes. They existed in the grey spaces, the places where ambition met opportunity, where pride wrestled with practicality, where the desire to preserve their world sometimes led them to support causes that history would judge harshly. The 14th and 15th centuries found the Malfoy family flourishing like their own enchanted gardens. While much of England suffered through plague, war, and political upheaval, the manor stood as an island of stability and prosperity, its protective enchantments growing stronger with each passing year, its wealth accumulating through ventures both mundane and magical. The family had perfected the art of existing in two worlds simultaneously, respected nobility in Muggle society, influential power brokers in the hidden magical community. During the Wars of the Roses, when the houses of Lancaster and York tore England apart in their struggle for the throne, the Malfoys demonstrated the cunning that had become their hallmark. Septimus Malfoy, who held the family name during those turbulent years, was a man of extraordinary political agility. He maintained friendships with both the Red Rose and the White, offering loans to both sides, providing counsel when asked, and somehow managing to emerge from each battle, each betrayal, each violent shift of power, with the family's position not just intact, but strengthened. His secret, whispered about in magical circles, but never proven, was a gift for legitimacy, the ability to read minds and intentions. Septimus would sit across from nobles and wizards alike, his pale grey eyes never quite meeting theirs directly, his posture relaxed and unthreatening, while his mind slipped quietly past their defenses to learn their true loyalties, their hidden plans, their most carefully guarded secrets. Armed with such knowledge, he could navigate any political maze, could be exactly what each person needed him to be, could position the Malfoy family always just slightly ahead of any dangerous turn of events. His wife, Morgana, a witch from the ancient and equally proud Black family, brought her own considerable talents to the union. She was a mistress of potion making, her skill so refined that even the most complex brews seemed to clarify under her stirring. In a room at the top of the manor's highest tower, she maintained a laboratory where cauldrons bubbled with potions that could heal, harm, or transform. She brewed Veritaserum before it had a proper name, Felix Felicis for moments when the family needed fortune's favor, and gentle sleeping draughts that she would sometimes give freely to villagers suffering from nightmares or insomnia. One of the few times the Malfoys showed unambiguous kindness to those they considered beneath their station. Together, Septimus and Morgana raised 4 children in the manor's luxurious embrace. The children grew up surrounded by every comfort wealth and magic could provide, educated by the finest tutors, both Muggle scholars who taught history and languages, and wandering magical masters who instructed in defensive spells, transfiguration, and the subtle arts of magical influence. The Malfoy children learned early that they were special, that their blood carried magic of the purest kind, that they were the inheritors of a legacy that stretched back through the mists of time to when magic itself was young. But privilege, as it so often does, came with its own burdens. The eldest son, Tiberius, felt the weight of expectation like a physical thing, pressing down on his shoulders from the moment he could understand what it meant to be the Malfoy heir. He was groomed for leadership from childhood, taught to manage estates and investments before most children learn to read properly, instructed in the delicate dance of wizarding politics before he'd experienced his first day at Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry, which had by then become the premier institution for magical education in Britain. Hogwarts itself had become intertwined with the Malfoy story by this time. The school, founded centuries earlier by the 4 legendary founders, had grown into a magnificent castle where young witches and wizards came to learn their craft. The Malfoys had always sent their children to Hogwarts, and always, those children were sorted into Slytherin House, the house of ambition and cunning, founded by Salazar Slytherin himself. The sorting hat would barely touch a Malfoy head before calling out Slytherin, as if there had never been any question, as if the family's ambition and pure blood pride made them natural inhabitants of the dungeons beneath the lake, where green-tinted light filtered through water and the common room was decorated with silver and emerald. Generation after generation of Malfoys walked those stone corridors, sat in those transfiguration and potions classes, practiced their wand movements in defense against the dark arts. They were invariably among the top students, their natural talent enhanced by the private tutoring they'd received before ever arriving at school. They rarely mixed with students from other houses, maintaining the Slytherin tradition of house loyalty and the Malfoy tradition of associating primarily with their own kind. Other pure blood families, other students whose names appeared in the registries of ancient magical lineages. The Malfoy children made alliances at Hogwarts that would serve them throughout their lives. They befriended the heirs of the Black family, the Lestranges, the Rosiers, the Averys, all the old names, all the families who shared their views on blood purity and magical superiority. These friendships, forged in the common room's flickering firelight and sealed through shared secrets whispered in empty classrooms, would weave a network of pure blood families that supported each other, intermarried, and worked together to maintain their collective power in wizarding society. Yet Hogwarts also presented challenges to the Malfoy worldview, though they rarely acknowledged this. In classes, they encountered Muggle-born students whose magical ability sometimes equaled or even exceeded their own. In Quidditch matches, they sometimes lost to houses they considered inferior. In examinations, despite their advantages, they occasionally found themselves outscored by students whose blood was not pure, whose families had no ancient manor, whose magic came from sources the Malfoys insisted were inferior. These moments created a cognitive dissonance that the family resolved not by questioning their beliefs, but by finding ways to dismiss or diminish such achievements. Natural talent, they would say, was not the same as the deep magical power that came from generations of wizarding heritage. As the 16th century dawned, the Malfoy family found themselves navigating new challenges. The wider Muggle world was changing rapidly. The Renaissance was transforming art and thought. The Reformation was splintering Christianity, and the age of exploration was expanding European knowledge of the world beyond their shores. The magical community watched these changes with a mixture of fascination and concern, wondering how the shifting Muggle landscape would affect their hidden society. It was during this time that Brutus Malfoy, a name that would become somewhat infamous in family history, took control of the family affairs. Brutus was a wizard of considerable power but questionable judgment, a man whose pride in his magical heritage sometimes manifested in cruelty toward those he considered lesser beings. He was known for what other wizards euphemistically called Muggle baiting, using magic to torment non-magical people for sport and amusement. On market days in nearby villages, strange things would happen that the Muggles could never quite explain. A merchant's cart would suddenly sprout wings and fly away, goods scattering across the cobblestones. A pompous nobleman would find his wig transfigured into a nest of singing birds. Wells would suddenly produce wine instead of water, causing confusion and celebration in equal measure. The Muggles attributed these events to miracles, demons, or excessive drinking, never suspecting that a bored wizard was responsible. watching from the shadows with a smirk on his aristocratic face. Brutus's behavior, while not uncommon among wizards of his time, represented a particular strand of Malfoy character, the dangerous edge where pride tipped into contempt, where power became excuse for casual cruelty. His wife, Violetta, a witch of the Bulstrode family, tried to temper his worst impulses, but she was fighting against generations of accumulated belief that wizarding folk were inherently superior to muggles and had the right to treat them as they pleased. Their arguments would echo through the manor's halls late at night, her voice raised in frustration, his dismissive and cold. "They are nothing, Violetta. Less than the house elves who serve our meals. Why should I constrain my amusement for their sake?" And she would respond, her words careful but firm, because power without restraint becomes tyranny, and tyrants inevitably fall. It was wisdom he never quite learned, though their children, listening from the stairs, absorbed both perspectives, the pride and the caution, the belief in superiority and the understanding that such belief required careful management. The 17th century brought the family new challenges and opportunities. As tensions between magical and muggle communities grew, with witch hunts becoming increasingly common and dangerous, the need for the statute of secrecy became apparent to magical authorities. The Malfoys, like other prominent wizarding families, were consulted on this monumental decision. Should the magical world hide itself completely from Muggle eyes, creating a permanent separation between the two communities? Lucius Malfoy II, named for an earlier ancestor and inheritor of all the family's accumulated pride, argued forcefully for the statute's passage. At the Ministry of Magic, which was beginning to take its modern form, he stood before assembled wizards and witches and made his case. "We have nothing to gain from continued contact with the Muggle world," he declared, his voice carrying the weight of centuries of family conviction. "They fear what they cannot understand, destroy what they cannot control. Let us withdraw behind our enchantments and protections. Let them have their world, and we shall have ours, and the magical community shall finally be safe to practice our arts without persecution." His arguments carried weight, for the Malfoy name meant something in these chambers. When the Statute of Secrecy finally passed in 1692, formally separating magical and Muggle societies, the Malfoys could claim partial credit for its implementation. It was a victory for their worldview, confirmation that wizarding society agreed with their belief that mixing with Muggles led only to danger and dilution of magical culture. With the two worlds now formally separated, the Malfoys focused their considerable energy entirely on magical society. They invested in Diagon Alley businesses, bought shares in Gringotts Wizarding Bank, funded the development of new potions and spells, and collected magical artifacts with increasing fervor. The vaults beneath Malfoy Manor grew crowded with treasures, cursed opals that brought misfortune to their bearers, vanishing cabinets that could transport objects across impossible distances, hand-carved wands from wand makers whose names were legend, and books of spells so dark that merely reading them could corrupt a weak-minded wizard. This collection of dark artifacts would become both a source of family pride and, centuries later, a source of profound danger. But in those years, they seemed merely interesting, powerful objects that represented the family's wealth and sophistication. The Malfoys told themselves they were preserving magical history, preventing dangerous objects from falling into irresponsible hands. If occasionally they used these objects for their own purposes, a curse to punish an enemy, an enchantment to ensure a business deal went their way, well, that was simply the privilege of ownership, the right of those wise enough and powerful enough to wield such tools responsibly. The 18th century saw continued Malfoy prosperity. Armand Malfoy II. There would be many repeated names through the generations, each heir hoping to capture some of the glory of notable ancestors, expanded the family's influence through strategic appointments to the Ministry of Magic. The Malfoys never sought the position of Minister for Magic itself. Such prominence was dangerous, making one a target for all manner of political attacks and public scrutiny. Instead, they preferred positions on the Wizengamot, the Wizarding Court, where they could influence laws and judgments, or advisory roles where they whispered counsel into the ears of those who did hold the highest offices. To all these generations, to all the accumulated wealth and power, the manor itself remained the heart of everything, the physical manifestation of family continuity and pride. Each generation added something to its magnificence, a new wing here, an expanded library there, gardens that grew ever more elaborate, with fountains that danced to unheard music and statuary that moved when observed from the corners of eyes. The house elves who served the family, creatures bound to the Malfoys by ancient magic and tradition, kept every surface polished to perfection, every tapestry free from dust, every magical portrait frame gleaming with care. The family's treatment of these house elves was complex, as were so many aspects of Malfoy character. They were not, generally speaking, actively cruel to their servants, but neither did they treat them with the kindness and respect such loyal service deserved. The elves were invisible, expected to anticipate needs before they were voiced, to remain unnoticed and unacknowledged except when errors required punishment. It was one more way the Malfoys demonstrated their belief in natural hierarchy, their conviction that some beings were simply meant to serve while others were meant to rule. As the 19th century arrived, bringing with it new magical advances and social changes, the Malfoy family remained proudly conservative, resisting anything that might threaten their position or their worldview. When voices began calling for greater rights for magical creatures, the Malfoys opposed such measures. When some progressive wizards suggested allowing Muggle-borns greater access to positions of power in magical society, the Malfoys fought against it. When the Ministry proposed new regulations on dark artifacts, the Malfoys used their influence to water down such laws, ensuring their own collection remained legal, or at least remained unexamined. This resistance to change, this determination to preserve the world as they believed it should be, would define the family through the coming century. They saw themselves as guardians of tradition, defenders of pure magical heritage, protectors of a way of life that stretched back to before the conquest. What they could not see, or refused to see, was that their pride was becoming rigidity, their tradition becoming stagnation, their protection becoming the very thing that would eventually threaten to destroy everything they had built. Abraxas Malfoy was born in 1919, in the aftermath of the Great War that had devastated the Muggle world. The manor, insulated by its enchantments and protections, had remained untouched by that conflict. Though distant, sounds of artillery fire had sometimes rolled across the countryside like summer thunder. Abraxas entered the world in the manor's finest bedroom, attended by magical healers and celebrated with enchanted fireworks that danced above the gardens, visible only to magical eyes. From his earliest moments, Abraxas was groomed to embody everything the Malfoy name represented. His father, Nicholas Malfoy, was a stern man who believed that affection made children soft, that discipline and expectation were the only proper tools for shaping an heir. Young Abraxas learned to walk in the manor's long corridors, his first steps supervised by house elves who followed at a careful distance, ready to catch him, but never daring to interfere unless absolutely necessary. He learned to speak with precise diction, his words measured and formal even as a child, for casual speech was considered beneath a Malfoy's dignity. The manor was his entire world in those early years. He played, though play for a Malfoy child was very different from ordinary childhood games. In rooms filled with enchanted toys that moved of their own accord, dolls that could converse in several languages, toy broomsticks that hovered just inches off the ground. His favorite haunt was the library, that vast repository of magical knowledge that occupied an entire wing of the manor, where books flew to the shelves when summoned, and portraits of scholarly ancestors offered commentary on whatever the young boy happened to be reading. It was in that library, at the age of 6, that Abraxas experienced his first significant display of accidental magic. He had been reading about transfiguration, fascinated by the idea that one thing could become another, that reality itself was malleable to magical will. In his excitement, he had unconsciously transfigured his chair into a miniature dragon, golden scales gleaming, wings spreading, small puffs of smoke emerging from delicate nostrils. The creature was no larger than a cat, but it was perfectly formed, and for several glorious moments before a house elf hastily reversed the transfiguration, Abraxas sat face to face with his own creation, wonder and pride mingling in his young heart. His father, when informed of the incident, showed the closest thing to approval that Nicholas Malfoy ever displayed. "The boy has power," he said to his wife, Hesper, who had worried that such early magic might be dangerous. "Good. He will need it." What power might be needed for was never specified, but Abraxas understood that he had pleased his father, and that was a rare enough occurrence to be treasured. As Abraxas grew, he was educated in all the subjects befitting a pure-blood heir. Ancient runes were taught by a withered old wizard who claimed to have studied at Durmstrang. Potions instruction came from a witch whose family had brewed for the Malfoys for 3 generations. He learned magical history, not the sanitized version taught at Hogwarts, but the true history as the old pure-blood families understood it, a history of wizarding supremacy occasionally interrupted by unfortunate periods when Muggles and Muggle-borns had gained too much influence, requiring correction by those wise enough to understand the proper order of things. The values instilled in young Abraxas were clear and consistent. Blood purity was paramount. The Malfoy name was sacred. Power was to be pursued, but wielded subtly, and the family's interests superseded all other considerations. He learned that Muggles were pitiable creatures, barely more than animals, and that Muggle-borns, while occasionally talented, were fundamentally inferior to wizards born of magical bloodlines. These lessons were delivered not with hatred, but with the calm certainty of stating obvious facts, which made them all the more insidious, all the harder to question. When Abraxas turned 11, the letter from Hogwarts arrived as expected, delivered by a magnificent eagle owl that landed on the manor's breakfast table with aristocratic precision. The letter was a formality. There had never been any doubt that a Malfoy would attend Hogwarts, just as there had never been any doubt which house would claim him. Still, the occasion was treated with appropriate ceremony. Abraxas and his parents travelled to Diagon Alley, that hidden magical shopping district in London, to purchase his school supplies. Diagon Alley in the 1930s was a place of wonder and mystery, its cobblestone streets winding between shops that sold everything a young wizard might need. Abraxas, walking between his parents with carefully maintained composure, felt his heart race with excitement he was too well trained to show on his face. They visited Ollivanders first, where the Wandmaker, a man with unsettling pale eyes that seemed to see too much, presented Abraxas with wand after wand, until finally one chose him, 18 inches, elm and dragon heartstring, good for dark magic, as Mr. Ollivander noted, with what might have been concern or merely observation. At Flourish and Blots, they purchased not just the required textbooks, but additional volumes on subjects like defensive magic, wand lore, and pure-blood family histories. At Madame Mawkins, Abraxas was fitted for robes of the finest material, befitting his station. His father purchased him a racing broom. Despite being a first year, the Malfoy name and fortune could secure special permissions, and a leather trunk with more compartments than seemed physically possible, each one expanded by extension charms. The journey to Hogwarts on the 1st of September was one Abraxas would remember with perfect clarity for the rest of his life. The Hogwarts Express, that scarlet steam engine, waited at platform 9 3/4, hidden from Muggle eyes behind magical barriers. Abraxas found a compartment with other pure-blood children, a Black, a Rosier, a Knot, and together they travelled north through the British countryside, watching through the windows as the landscape transformed from gentle southern hills to the wilder beauty of Scotland. The sorting ceremony, held in the Great Hall, beneath its enchanted ceiling that reflected the night sky outside, was exactly as his father had described. The sorting hat, ancient and patched, was placed upon his head, and before it had even settled properly, it called out, "Slytherin," in a voice that echoed through the hall. Abraxas walked with measured dignity to the Slytherin table, where older students applauded his arrival, welcoming another of the sacred 28 families, those pure-blood dynasties that form the core of wizarding aristocracy. The Slytherin common room became his second home. Located in the dungeons beneath the Black Lake, it was decorated in silver and green, with comfortable leather sofas arranged before a carved fireplace, and windows that showed the murky depths of the lake, where occasionally the shadow of the giant squid would drift past. Here, Abraxas thrived. He excelled in his classes, particularly potions and defense against the dark arts. He made alliances that would last throughout his life, joining a circle of pure-blood students who shared his family's values and worldview. Yet Hogwarts was not without its challenges to that worldview. There were Muggle-born students in his year, including a girl named Elizabeth Hartley, who consistently scored higher than Abraxas in charms, despite her non-magical parentage. This should have been impossible according to everything he'd been taught. Yet there it was, undeniable. Abraxas dealt with this cognitive dissonance the way generations of purebloods had before him, by finding ways to dismiss it. She was merely good at memorization, he told himself, at following instructions. True magical power, the deep understanding that came from generations of magical heritage, that was something she could never possess. As the years passed, Abraxas grew from boy to young man within Hogwarts' ancient walls. He became a prefect, then head boy, wearing the badge with the same aristocratic grace his ancestors had brought to every position of authority. He captained the Slytherin Quidditch team, leading them to victory more often than not. He developed a reputation as a student of exceptional talent and questionable character, brilliant in his coursework, but known for a certain casual cruelty toward those he considered beneath him, for hexes cast in empty corridors when teachers weren't watching, for the way his eyes would go cold when confronted with those who didn't show proper respect. It was during his final years at Hogwarts that Abraxas first heard whispers of a young man named Tom Riddle, a student several years ahead of him, who spoke eloquently about the natural superiority of pure-blood wizards, about the injustice of hiding from muggles when wizards should rightfully rule them. Abraxas never knew Riddle personally. By the time Abraxas reached his upper years, Riddle had already graduated, but the ideas Riddle had planted in fertile soil continued to grow and spread among Slytherin students. These ideas resonated with Abraxas in ways that should perhaps have concerned him. The notion that wizards were meant to rule, that the statute of secrecy was an act of cowardice rather than wisdom, that power should be seized rather than exercised subtly from the shadows. It was intoxicating, this validation of the superiority he'd been taught to believe in from birth. He graduated from Hogwarts in 1937, just as storm clouds were gathering over both the magical and muggle worlds, returning to Malfoy Manor with his head full of dangerous ideas and his heart full of pride. The years that followed saw Abraxas take his place in wizarding society. He joined the Ministry of Magic in an advisory capacity, his name and family connections opening doors that remained closed to those of lesser birth. He sat on the boards of various magical institutions, made strategic investments that increased the family's already considerable fortune, and began the process of selecting an appropriate wife. For love was never the primary consideration in such matters. Bloodline, breeding, and beneficial family connections were what mattered. He chose Ophelia Greengrass, a young woman from another respectable pure-blood family, beautiful in a cold, classical way, with platinum hair only slightly darker than his own, and the same aristocratic features that marked all the old families. Their courtship was formal, chaperoned, more a negotiation than a romance. They discussed bloodlines and family histories, compared their views on proper magical society, and found themselves in comfortable agreement on all the important matters. When Abraxas proposed, in the manor's rose garden under moonlight, with words chosen more for their propriety than their passion, Ophelia accepted with the same cool composure with which the offer had been made. They married in a ceremony that was the social event of the season, held at the manor, with hundreds of guests from all the best wizarding families. The gardens had been enchanted to surpass even their usual magnificence, with flowers that sang in harmony and fairy lights that danced through the air like captured stars. The wedding itself was traditional in every way, bound by ancient magical vows that tied their lives and magics together. It was beautiful, flawless, perfect, and utterly lacking in genuine warmth or joy. Their son was born in 1954, and they named him Lucius, after that long-ago ancestor who had helped secure the Statute of Secrecy. From his very first breath, young Lucius Malfoy was destined to carry the weight of centuries of family expectation, pride, and accumulated beliefs. Abraxas held his son in the manor's master bedroom, looking down at the small face with its wisps of platinum hair, and felt a surge of pride mixed with determination. This child would be raised properly, would embody everything a Malfoy should be, would bring glory to the family name. And so began the careful, methodical process of creating Lucius Malfoy, the man who would one day take all his family's pride and prejudice and follow them into the darkest places imaginable. But in those early days, as baby Lucius slept in his enchanted cradle, while house elves watched over him and his parents planned his future with exacting precision, none of that was yet written. The path was being laid, stone by stone, but the choice to walk it or not that remained for a time uncertain. Abraxas raised his son with the same stern discipline he himself had experienced, believing that this was the only way to forge a proper heir. Young Lucius learned to walk in the same corridors his father had mastered decades before. He learned proper speech, proper bearing, proper disdain for those beneath his station. He learned magical theory before he could properly hold a wand, learned about bloodlines and family honor before he could understand what such concepts truly meant. He learned, above all, that he was special, chosen, inherently superior by virtue of his birth. The manor became young Lucius's classroom and playground, just as it had been for Abraxas. The library's ancient books became his companions, the house elves, his invisible servants, the portraits his stern judges and occasional teachers. When his accidental magic first manifested, levitating his toys, changing the colors of things at will, Abraxas watched with satisfaction. The boy had power, as a Malfoy should. Good. He would need it for the world Abraxas could sense was coming, a world where power would matter more than ever, where those with the strength and will to seize it would shape the future of magical society. Lucius Malfoy graduated from Hogwarts in 1972, returning to the manor as a young man of 18, handsome in the cold, aristocratic way of his bloodline, intelligent, ambitious, and absolutely certain of his place in the world. His 7 years at Hogwarts had been triumphant by every measure the pure blood society valued. He had been a prefect, excelled in his studies, moved through the castle's corridors with the easy confidence of someone who knew they were destined for greatness. The Sorting Hat's decision had been instantaneous. Slytherin. And in that house of ambition, Lucius had found his tribe, his allies, his future. But Hogwarts had given Lucius more than education and connections. It had introduced him to ideas that would shape his destiny in ways his father could never have fully anticipated. During Lucius's school years, whispers had circulated through the Slytherin common room about a powerful wizard who spoke of wizarding supremacy, who believed that magical folk should not hide from muggles, but should rule over them as nature intended. This wizard, who had taken the name Lord Voldemort, was gathering followers, young, ambitious purebloods who believed in his vision of a new world order. Lucius had been intrigued by these whispers from the start. Everything about Voldemort's philosophy resonated with what he had been taught since birth, that pure blood wizards were superior, that the current state of magical society was a corruption of natural hierarchy, that those with power had not just the right, but the duty to use it to reshape the world. These were not radical ideas to Lucius. They were simply the logical extension of everything the Malfoy family had always believed, said aloud rather than whispered in private. In the summer following his graduation, Lucius was formally introduced to Lord Voldemort. The meeting took place not at the manor. Abraxas was too cautious for that, still uncertain whether this rising Dark Lord was a true visionary or merely another dangerous fanatic. But in the home of the Lestrange family, another ancient pure-blood dynasty that had already pledged their loyalty, Lucius arrived in his finest robes, his platinum hair perfectly arranged, his expression carefully neutral despite the anticipation churning in his chest. Voldemort, when Lucius finally stood before him, was not what he had expected. There was still some handsomeness in that face, though it was beginning to be twisted by the dark magic he practiced, the soul-splitting horrors he had committed in his quest for immortality. But his eyes, red as blood, cold as winter frost, held power that Lucius could feel like a physical force. When Voldemort spoke, his voice was soft, almost gentle, but it carried absolute authority. He spoke of the world as it should be, of wizards stepping out from hiding to claim their rightful place, of pure blood families restored to their proper glory. Lucius Malfoy, Voldemort said, and the sound of his own name from those lips sent a thrill through Lucius's body. Your family has always understood the value of power, the importance of bloodline. I offer you the chance to be part of something greater than mere wealth and social position. I offer you the opportunity to reshape the very foundations of our world. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. Lucius knelt before the Dark Lord and received the mark, that burning brand pressed into his left forearm, the skull and serpent that marked him forever as a Death Eater, a servant of Lord Voldemort's vision. The pain was excruciating, like being burned from the inside out. But Lucius bore it without a sound, his jaw clenched, his pride refusing to show weakness. When it was done, when the mark lay dark against his pale skin, Lucius felt a strange mixture of exhilaration and unease. He had committed himself to a path from which there could be no turning back. Abraxas, when he learned of his son's choice, was conflicted in ways that troubled his usual certainty. On one hand, Voldemort's ideology aligned perfectly with Malfoy family values. On the other hand, Abraxas had survived and prospered by never fully committing to any cause that might endanger the family's position. He had always believed in operating from the shadows, in influence rather than open allegiance. But his son was a man now, entitled to make his own choices, and Abraxas could not deny the appeal of Voldemort's promised new world order. "Be careful, Lucius," was all Abraxas said, standing in the manor's drawing room, with evening light falling through tall windows. "Power is seductive, but it is also dangerous. Remember always that the family comes first. Before ideology, before loyalty to any lord, the Malfoy name must be protected." Lucius listened, nodded, and promptly decided that his father was being overcautious. The old pure-blood families had been too timid for too long, hiding their superiority apologizing for their bloodlines. Voldemort understood that power meant nothing if you were afraid to use it. Lucius threw himself into his new role with enthusiasm, attending secret meetings, participating in raids against Voldemort's enemies, learning dark magic from the Dark Lord himself. Yet even as he embraced this dangerous new path, Lucius maintained his respectable facade in ordinary wizarding society. He took a position at the Ministry of Magic, used his family's wealth and connections to cultivate relationships with influential wizards, and presented himself as a concerned citizen, worried about the declining standards in magical education and the increasing influence of Muggle-borns in traditional wizarding institutions. By day, he was Lucius Malfoy, sophisticated aristocrat and ministry advisor. By night, he was a Death Eater, carrying out Voldemort's will with cold efficiency. It was during this time that Lucius met Narcissa Black, the youngest daughter of Cygnus and Druella Black, sister to Bellatrix and Andromeda. Narcissa was beautiful, pale skin, pale hair, the aristocratic features common to all the old pure-blood families. But more than that, she possessed a quiet strength and intelligence that Lucius found compelling. Unlike her sister Bellatrix, whose devotion to Voldemort bordered on obsession, Narcissa was more measured, more pragmatic. She believed in pure blood supremacy, certainly, but her primary loyalty was to family rather than ideology. Their courtship was conducted with appropriate propriety, chaperoned meetings in public places, formal dinners at each other's family homes. Narcissa's family approved of the match. The Malfoys were one of the wealthiest and most influential pure-blood families, and Lucius himself was handsome, intelligent, and ambitious. Lucius's father approved for similar reasons. The Blacks were an ancient and respectable family, and Narcissa's bloodline was impeccable. That the two young people actually found they enjoyed each other's company was considered a fortunate bonus rather than a necessity. They married in 1977 in a ceremony that rivaled Abraxas and Ophelia's wedding in magnificence. The manor's gardens were transformed into something from a fairy tale, with enchantments that made the very air shimmer with magic. The guest list included the most prominent names in wizarding society, though notably it did not include Narcissa's sister Andromeda, who had committed the unforgivable sin of marrying a Muggle-born and been burned from the Black family tapestry as punishment. The wedding was beautiful, traditional, everything such an occasion should be, but it was also shadowed by the war that was growing ever more violent in the wizarding world. Many of the guests wore long sleeves to hide the dark marks on their arms. Conversations at the reception, held in the manor's ballroom beneath floating candles, were careful, coded, as people tried to discern who supported Voldemort and who opposed him, who could be trusted and who might be an enemy. Narcissa moved into Malfoy Manor as its new mistress, and she adapted to her role with grace and efficiency. She redecorated certain rooms to her taste, supervised the house elves with firm but less harsh management than previous generations had employed, and began the process of making the manor not just a monument to family history, but a home. She understood, perhaps better than Lucius did at that time, that even the proudest families needed warmth as well as grandeur, that cold perfection could become a prison. Their son was born on June 5th, 1980, and they named him Draco, Dragon, a name that spoke of power and ancient magic. Lucius held his newborn son in the same bedroom where he himself had been born, looking down at the small face with its wisps of platinum hair, and felt emotions he had not anticipated. Love, certainly, but also a fierce protectiveness that surprised him with its intensity. This child was his legacy, the future of the Malfoy line, and Lucius found himself making silent promises that Draco would inherit a world where pure-blood wizards ruled as they should, where the Malfoy name commanded not just respect but power. But the war was not going as Voldemort had promised. The Order of the Phoenix, led by Albus Dumbledore, was mounting effective resistance. Aurors were hunting Death Eaters with increasing success. And then, in the autumn of 1981, came the news that changed everything. Voldemort had fallen. He had gone to Godric's Hollow to kill the Potter family, and somehow, impossibly, he had been destroyed by a 1-year-old child named Harry Potter. The wizarding world erupted in celebration, but for Lucius and other Death Eaters, it was a catastrophe. Everything they had worked for, everything they had risked, had crumbled in a single night. Worse, Aurors were rounding up known Death Eaters, sending them to Azkaban prison, where Dementors guarded the cells and drove prisoners slowly mad with despair. Lucius, however, had always been too clever to be caught so easily. While other Death Eaters went to Azkaban, Lucius employed the strategy his father had always advocated. He used his wealth and connections. He claimed he had been under the Imperious Curse, forced to serve Voldemort against his will. He made generous donations to worthy causes, befriended the right ministry officials, and presented himself as a victim rather than a perpetrator. His story was implausible to anyone who thought about it carefully, but Lucius made it more convenient to believe him than to prosecute him. He kept his freedom, kept his wealth, kept his position in society. But the cost was higher than he had anticipated. He had to watch his words carefully, always aware that he was suspected, always conscious that any misstep might send him to Azkaban after all. The dark mark on his arm, once a source of pride, became a brand of shame he had to hide beneath long sleeves. And in the privacy of the manor, in the quiet moments when he was alone with his thoughts, Lucius had to confront the uncomfortable reality that he had chosen poorly, that his father's caution had been wisdom after all, yet he could not quite bring himself to renounce the ideology that had led him down this path. He still believed in pure blood supremacy, still felt that Muggle-borns were inferior, still dreamed of a world where wizards like him held unquestioned power. He simply became more careful about expressing such views, more subtle about working towards such goals. He used his position on the Hogwarts Board of Governors to influence school policy in ways that favored pure blood students. He donated to political causes that quietly advanced traditionalist views. He raised his son to believe all the same things he had been taught, passing the torch of prejudice to the next generation. Narcissa watched her husband navigate these dangerous years with mixed feelings. She had never shared Bellatrix's fanatical devotion to Voldemort. She had married Lucius because she loved him, not because of his dark mark. Now, as she watched him struggle with the consequences of choices made in youth and pride, she felt both sympathy and frustration. She had warned him gently that absolute commitment to any cause was dangerous, but Lucius had been too proud, too certain to listen. Still, they made it work. They raised their son in luxury and love. A cold kind of love, perhaps, measured and formal, but love nonetheless. They maintained their position in wizarding society through careful management and generous donations. They kept the manor beautiful and the family name respected. And they waited, as many former Death Eaters waited, for some sign that their Dark Lord might return, that the dreams of pure blood supremacy might yet be realized. The years passed slowly, marked by small triumphs and constant vigilance. Lucius served on various boards and committees, wielding influence from positions of apparent respectability. Narcissa raised Draco with care, ensuring he received the best education, the finest things, and a thorough grounding in family values and pure blood ideology. The manor remained a sanctuary, its ancient walls protecting them from a world that had not turned out quite as they had hoped. Draco Malfoy's earliest memories were of beauty and privilege beyond what most children could imagine. He grew up in rooms with ceilings so high they seemed to touch the sky, walked on floors of polished marble that reflected his small form like still water, played in gardens where flowers bloomed in impossible colors and fountains danced to music only magical ears could hear. The manor was his kingdom, and from his earliest understanding, he knew that he was special, chosen, born to a destiny of importance and power. His childhood was structured, orderly, guided by traditions stretching back through centuries. House elves attended to his every need before he could voice it. Clothes laid out each morning, meals served on silver platters, toys that appeared and disappeared as if by thought alone. His mother, Narcissa, was a constant presence in those early years, more affectionate than Malfoy parents typically were, reading to him in her sitting room, where afternoon light fell softly through tall windows, teaching him the family history, the names of ancestors whose portraits watched from the walls with eyes that seemed to follow his movements. His father, Lucius, was a more distant figure, commanding respect and a kind of fearful admiration. Lucius would summon young Draco to his study, a room of dark wood and leather smelling of old books and expensive cologne, and there he would instruct his son in what it meant to be a Malfoy. "We are not like other families," Lucius would say, his voice measured and certain. "Our blood is pure, untainted by Muggle contamination. This makes us superior, Draco. Never forget that. The world may not always acknowledge our rightful place, but that does not make it any less true." Draco absorbed these lessons like parchment absorbing ink, never questioning, never doubting. Why would he? Everything in his world confirmed what his father taught. The house elves bowed and scraped before him. Visitors to the manor treated him with deference appropriate to his station. When his parents took him to Diagon Alley, shopkeepers fell over themselves to serve the Malfoy family, and other children stared at him with what he interpreted as awe and envy. His first accidental magic manifested when he was 6 years old, during a fit of temper over some trivial frustration now long forgotten. His toys had suddenly begun flying around his room, swirling in a miniature tornado of stuffed dragons and toy broomsticks. His mother had come running at the commotion, but instead of alarm, her face had shown relief and pride. "There it is," she had murmured, gathering him into her arms. "Your magic, darling, just as it should be." Lucius, informed of the incident, had nodded with satisfaction. The boy had power. Good. He would need it. Before Hogwarts, Draco received private tutoring in magic and history, reading and arithmetic. all the subjects appropriate for a pure-blood heir. His tutors were carefully selected, wizards and witches from respectable families who shared the Malfoy worldview. They taught him not just facts, but interpretations, not just history, but a particular version of history where pure-blood families were always noble defenders of proper magical culture, where Muggle-borns were unfortunate accidents who diluted the purity of wizarding society, where the ministry's current policies represented a dangerous deviation from traditional values. He had friends of sorts, children from other pure-blood families who visited the manor for formal playdates that were really opportunities for parents to maintain important social connections. Theodore Nott, whose father had been a Death Eater, like Lucius. Vincent Crabbe and Gregory Goyle, whose families had served the Malfoys for generations, their sons already being groomed to serve Draco in the same way. These weren't relationships of equals, but of master and followers. And Draco learned early how to command, how to expect obedience, how to wield the power of his family name like a weapon. The letter from Hogwarts arrived on Draco's 11th birthday, delivered by an enormous eagle owl that landed with impressive precision beside his breakfast plate. Though the letter's arrival had been expected, there had never been any doubt that a Malfoy would attend Hogwarts. Draco felt his heart race with excitement and pride. This was the beginning of his real life, the start of his journey toward the greatness his father promised awaited him. The trip to Diagon Alley to purchase his school supplies was a grand occasion. Lucius walked through the magical shopping district with his characteristic elegant stride, his walking stick tapping on cobblestones, Draco beside him, trying to match his father's graceful confidence. At Madame Malkin's, Draco was fitted for his robes and met, for the first time, a boy with messy black hair and green eyes who was also being fitted. The boy seemed uncertain, overwhelmed by the magical world, and Draco had immediately felt superior. Clearly this boy didn't understand the importance of proper connections, proper breeding. He would learn differently, Draco thought, when he reached Hogwarts. At Ollivander's, Draco was presented with wand after wand, until finally one chose him. 10 inches, hawthorn and unicorn hair, reasonably springy. Mr. Ollivander had examined him with those unsettling pale eyes, and remarked that unicorn hair wands were particularly faithful and difficult to turn to the dark arts. Lucius's expression had tightened almost imperceptibly at this observation, though he said nothing. The journey to Hogwarts on the Hogwarts Express was Draco's first real experience away from his parents' direct supervision. He found a compartment with Crabbe and Goyle, and together they travelled north through the British countryside. It was during this journey that Draco encountered that same black-haired boy from Madame Malkin's, Harry Potter, as he now learned. The boy who lived, the child who had somehow destroyed the Dark Lord. Draco had extended his hand in friendship, as his father had instructed him to do if he encountered Potter. You'll soon find out. Some wizarding families are much better than others, Potter. You don't want to go making friends with the wrong sort. But Potter had rejected him, had chosen to befriend a red-haired Weasley, blood traitors who associated with Muggles, instead of accepting Draco's offer of alliance. The rejection stung more than Draco would have admitted, transforming what might have been strategic friendliness into genuine animosity. The sorting ceremony was both thrilling and terrifying. The Great Hall was more magnificent than Draco had imagined, candles floating in midair, the ceiling enchanted to show the night sky. 4 long tables filled with students whose eyes all turned to watch as first years were called forward. When the sorting hat was placed on Draco's head, it barely touched his platinum hair before shouting, "Slytherin!" with decisive certainty. Draco walked to the Slytherin table with his head high, pride warming him like the fire that crackled in the common room fireplace. Slytherin became Draco's home within Hogwarts. The common room in the dungeons, with its green-tinted light filtering through windows that looked into the lake, its leather sofas and carved fireplace, felt comfortable and familiar. Here were students like him, ambitious, proud, mostly pure blood. Here he could be himself without apology, without the careful management required in more mixed company. But Hogwarts was not quite what his father had prepared him for. The teachers, while respectful of his family name, did not defer to him the way adults did at home. Professor Snape, the head of Slytherin House, showed him some favoritism, but even Snape expected actual effort and skill, not just family connections. And then there was Harry Potter, insufferable, famous Harry Potter, who seemed to excel without even trying, who won points for Gryffindor, who caught the snitch in his first Quidditch match, despite having no business being on the team at all. Draco's rivalry with Harry became the defining feature of his Hogwarts years. It was personal in ways he couldn't quite articulate, rooted in that first rejection on the train and fed by his father's careful hints about Potter's role in the Dark Lord's downfall. Every encounter became a battle, insults exchanged in corridors, hexes cast when teachers weren't watching, constant jockeying for social position and the house points. Draco formed his own little gang, himself, Crabbe, Goyle, and later Pansy Parkinson, who seemed to adore him. And together, they made themselves thorns in the sides of Potter and his friends. Yet beneath the bravado and the bullying, Draco was not quite as certain as he pretended to be. In quiet moments, alone in his 4-poster bed, with the curtains drawn, he sometimes wondered why he felt such anger toward Potter, such need to prove himself superior. In classes, he worked harder than he let anyone see, terrified of the shame that would come from being outperformed by Muggle-borns like Hermione Granger, who consistently scored higher than him despite her inferior blood. These doubts, these small cracks in his certainty, he pushed down and buried beneath pride and performance. The years passed, marked by small dramas and escalating tensions. Draco's second year brought the reopening of the Chamber of Secrets and the revelation that Harry Potter could speak Parcel Tongue, the language of serpents, ability associated with dark wizards and Salazar Slytherin himself. Draco's father had somehow been involved in these events, though Draco didn't understand exactly how, and the year ended with Lucius Malfoy being forced off the Hogwarts Board of Governors, a humiliation that Draco felt like a personal wound. Third year brought more complications. Sirius Black's escape from Azkaban, Dementors patrolling the school grounds, and a hippogriff named Buckbeak that attacked Draco when he foolishly insulted the creature. The injury itself wasn't serious, superficial cuts that Madame Pomfrey healed easily, but Draco exaggerated his suffering dramatically, partly from genuine shock and partly from a desire for attention and sympathy. His father tried to have the creature executed, turning the incident into a crusade that said more about Lucius's need to reassert power than about any real danger Buckbeak posed. But it was Draco's 4th year that brought the first real shadows of what was to come. The Tri-Wizard tournament dominated the year, and once again, Harry Potter was at the center of attention, competing in tasks designed for students far older. Draco wore a badge that read, "Potter stinks," and delighted in mocking Harry at every opportunity. Yet at the year's end came news that sent cold fear through every pure-blood family that had once supported Voldemort. The Dark Lord had returned. Draco watched his father in the days following Voldemort's resurrection. Lucius had been summoned to the Dark Lord's side, and when he returned to the manor, there was a tension in him that Draco had never seen before. His father's left arm was often held stiffly, as if it pained him, and conversations between his parents stopped abruptly when Draco entered rooms. The world, Draco realized, with growing unease, was changing in ways he didn't fully understand, but instinctively feared. 5th year was marked by increasing ministry interference at Hogwarts, with Dolores Umbridge instituting draconian rules and forming an inquisitorial squad that Draco joined with enthusiasm. Here finally was official sanction for his animosity toward Potter and his friends, permission to exercise power and authority. He patrolled corridors with his badge gleaming on his chest, catching students breaking Umbridge's ridiculous rules, and felt important, necessary, powerful. Yet even this satisfaction was hollow, somehow, tainted by the growing awareness that larger forces were moving, that the game was becoming more dangerous than mere school rivalries. Then came his 6th year, and everything changed. The summer before term began, Draco received a summons he had both dreaded and anticipated. He was to meet the Dark Lord. His father had fallen from favor after the disaster at the Ministry of Magic, where Lucius and other Death Eaters had been caught and identified. Now, Voldemort had a task for Draco. Not an honor, as Draco tried to tell himself, but a punishment aimed at Lucius through his son. The task was impossible. Draco was to repair a vanishing cabinet and use it to smuggle Death Eaters into Hogwarts. And then, when that was accomplished, Draco was to kill Albus Dumbledore, the greatest wizard of the age, the one person Voldemort himself feared. Draco had knelt before the Dark Lord in a drawing room of his own home. His home, violated by this terrible presence, and accepted the mission with a dark mark burning its way into his left forearm. The pain of receiving the mark was nothing compared to the horror that followed. As the summer faded and the reality of his task settled over him like a shroud, Draco realized he had been sent on a suicide mission. If he succeeded, he would become a murderer. If he failed, Voldemort would kill him, and probably his family as well. There was no escape, no way out, no adult he could turn to for help. His 6th year at Hogwarts was torture, while his classmates worried about exams and Quidditch and dating. Draco worked in the Room of Requirement, desperately trying to repair the vanishing cabinet, knowing that every passing day brought him closer to an impossible choice. He grew thin, pale, haunted. He cried in Moaning Myrtle's bathroom, something he would once have considered humiliating, but now seemed merely appropriate to his situation. He tried to kill Dumbledore through indirect means. A cursed necklace meant for someone else, poisoned mead that nearly killed Ron Weasley instead. But he couldn't bring himself to do the deed directly, face to face. In the end, on top of the astronomy tower, with Dumbledore wandless and weakened before him, Draco stood with his wand raised and found he couldn't cast the curse. He had been raised to believe in pure blood supremacy, in the rightness of violence against those who opposed his worldview. But when faced with actually taking a life, he discovered he was not the person he had been taught to be. He was 16 years old, terrified, and despite everything, not a murderer. Severus Snape completed the task for him, killing Dumbledore, while Draco watched in horrified relief. Then came flight through the castle, Death Eaters destroying what they touched, and escape into the night. Hogwarts, his home for 6 years, was forever tainted now. He could not return. The manor in the final year of the war became something it had never been in all its centuries of existence, a prison, not for captives, though there were those too. Prisoners held in the cellar, their screams echoing through ancient stones that had witnessed many things, but never quite this level of horror. No, the manor was a prison for the Malfoys themselves, trapped in their own home by circumstance and fear, watching as everything they had built over generations crumbled around them like castle walls under siege. Draco returned from Hogwarts to find the manor transformed. Death Eaters came and went as they pleased, treating the family's ancestral home as their headquarters, their meeting place, their torture chamber. Voldemort himself took residence in the manor's finest rooms, and the Malfoys, once so proud, so certain of their superiority, were reduced to servants in their own home, too terrified to object, too compromised to escape. Lucius was a shadow of the man he had been. His time in Azkaban, brief though it was, had left marks that went deeper than physical scars. The proud aristocrat who had once walked through ministry corridors with elegant confidence now moved through his own home with hunched shoulders and downcast eyes, his walking stick no longer an affectation of style, but a needed support. His wand had been taken by Voldemort, the ultimate humiliation for a wizard, and given to another. He was powerless, impotent, watching his family's legacy being destroyed by the very cause he had once championed. Narcissa held the family together through sheer force of will, while her husband retreated into defeated silence and her son struggled with trauma and guilt. Narcissa remained outwardly composed, navigating the dangerous currents of Death Eater politics with the same careful grace she had once applied to pure blood social gatherings. But inside, her heart was breaking. She watched Draco grow thinner, paler, more haunted with each passing day. She saw how he flinched at sudden noises, how his hand trembled when summoned to Voldemort's presence, how he stared at his dark mark with a mixture of horror and resignation. The manor's beauty became grotesque under this occupation. The elegant drawing room, where generations of Malfoys had entertained, became a chamber where Voldemort held court, where Charity Burbage, the Muggle Studies professor, was suspended over the table and murdered, while the Malfoys were forced to watch. The dining room, where family meals had been served on silver platters, became a place where prisoners were interrogated and tortured. The gardens where Draco had played as a child were patrolled by Death Eaters, their beauty now sinister rather than serene. In the cellar, house elves, who had served the family for generations, now guarded prisoners. Luna Lovegood, Mr. Ollivander, and others. Draco could hear their cries through the manor's floors, and each scream was a knife to his conscience. This was what his ideology led to, what his family's proud beliefs had produced. Not greatness, not glory, but this. Innocent people suffering in the dungeons of his childhood home, while he stood by, unable, or unwilling to help. Then came that terrible night in the spring of 1998, when Harry Potter, Hermione Granger, and Ron Weasley were captured and brought to the manor. Draco stood in the drawing room, his parents beside him, and was asked to identify Potter. He looked at Harry's swollen, distorted face. A stinging jinx had been cast to disguise his features, and for a moment, everything hung in balance. He knew it was Potter. He could see it despite the swelling, could recognize those green eyes even in that ruined face. "I can't be sure," Draco heard himself say, the words coming from somewhere deep inside him that still retained the capacity to choose mercy over certainty, to protect rather than condemn. His mother glanced at him sharply, understanding immediately what he had done, and in her eyes he saw not disappointment, but something that might have been approval or relief or recognition. What followed was chaos. Bellatrix torturing Hermione Granger in the drawing room, her screams tearing through the manor like accusations. Draco stood frozen, helpless, listening to those screams and feeling his soul shatter a little more with each one. This was his aunt, his family, doing these unspeakable things in his home. This was what pure blood pride had become. Then came the sounds of fighting from the cellar. Dobby, the house elf his father had once owned, appearing to help the prisoners escape. In the confusion of battle, Draco watched his wand being torn from his hand by Harry Potter, felt the loss of it like losing a limb. And then they were gone. The prisoners escaped, Dobby dead on the beach beyond the manor's wards, and the Malfoys left to face Voldemort's wrath at having let Potter slip through their fingers once again. The Battle of Hogwarts came barely weeks later, and it brought the Malfoy family story to its crisis point. They went to the battle not from loyalty to Voldemort, but from desperation. Narcissa frantically searching for Draco amid the chaos, Lucius following his wife, both of them past caring about ideology or victory or anything except finding their son. In the Forbidden Forest, when Voldemort called Harry Potter to surrender himself, Narcissa was sent to check if the boy was dead. She knelt beside Harry's still form, her heart pounding, and whispered the only question that mattered to her. "Is Draco alive? Is he in the castle?" When Harry whispered that yes, Draco was alive, Narcissa made the choice that would redeem her family. She lied to Voldemort. She told the Dark Lord that Harry Potter was dead, knowing that in doing so, she was betraying everything the Malfoys had claimed to stand for, but choosing her son's life over ideology, over pride, over centuries of accumulated belief. In the final battle, the Malfoys were present, but not truly participating. They huddled together in the entrance hall, a family unit unto themselves, no longer caring who won or lost, knowing only that they needed to survive, to stay together, to somehow endure whatever came next. When Voldemort finally fell, destroyed by his own rebounding curse, the Malfoys did not celebrate. They simply held each other and felt the weight of relief mixed with the crushing awareness of how close they had come to losing everything that actually mattered. The days and weeks following the battle were a blur of uncertainty and fear. Death Eaters were being rounded up, sent to Azkaban, their trials swift and their sentences harsh. The Malfoys waited in the manor, now just a house again, emptied of Death Eaters and dark magic, feeling too large and too haunted, expecting at any moment to be arrested, to lose their freedom and perhaps their lives. But Harry Potter spoke for them. the boy who lived, the one Draco had tormented through 6 years of school, testified that Narcissa had saved his life, that the Malfoys had ultimately withdrawn from the battle, that Draco had hesitated to identify him when such identification might have changed everything. The testimony didn't erase their crimes, didn't absolve them of their choices, but it was enough to keep them out of Azkaban, enough to give them a chance at redemption rather than punishment. Lucius was sentenced to house arrest, forbidden from leaving the manor's grounds for 2 years. It was a lenient sentence given his crimes, and he knew it. He accepted the restrictions with the first humility he had shown in his entire life, understanding that he had been given a gift he did not deserve, the chance to watch his son grow up, to live with his wife, to have time to confront what he had become. The manor during those years of house arrest was a different place from what it had been. The family dismissed most of the house elves, keeping only those who wished to stay and paying them wages, a practice that would have been unthinkable in earlier generations. They removed or destroyed the darkest artifacts from their collection, recognizing that some things were too dangerous, too corrupted to be kept even by those who claimed they could wield them responsibly. The drawing room was redecorated entirely, unable to be used as it was after all that had occurred there. Draco, free to leave, but choosing often to stay, spent those years trying to understand who he was beyond his family name, beyond the ideology he had been raised to believe. He took long walks through the manor's gardens, through groves where white peacocks still strutted, but where the oppressive sense of dark magic had finally begun to lift. He read books from the library, not the ones on pure blood supremacy and dark magic, but histories that told different stories, philosophies that challenged everything he had been taught. He found himself thinking often of the people he had hurt or failed to help, the muggle-borns he had tormented at school, the prisoners in his cellar whose screams still echoed in his nightmares, Hermione Granger's cries as Bellatrix tortured her. These memories were weights he carried, stones in his pockets that made every step heavier. He could not undo what had been done, could not erase his participation in such horrors. But perhaps, he thought in his better moments, he could choose to be different going forward. It was during this time that Draco reconnected with Astoria Greengrass, a young woman from a respectable pure-blood family, younger than him, who had not been involved in the war in any significant way. They had known each other slightly at Hogwarts. She had been in Slytherin, several years behind him, but had not been close. Now, meeting again at a gathering of old families trying to rebuild their reputations and relationships, they found themselves drawn to each other. Astoria was different from what Draco expected. She came from a pure-blood family. Yes, but the Greengrasses had not been Death Eaters, had managed to stay neutral through the war. More importantly, Astoria had emerged from her upbringing with views that challenged traditional pure-blood ideology. She believed in blood purity not as a marker of superiority, but simply as a cultural tradition, no more or less valid than any other. She treated house elves with kindness, spoke respectfully of muggle-borns, and gently questioned some of Draco's inherited assumptions in ways that made him think rather than bristle defensively. Their courtship was slow, careful, both of them damaged in different ways by the war and its aftermath. They walked together in the manor's gardens, talking for hours about everything and nothing, about books and magic, about what they wanted from life, about how to build something good from the ruins of bad choices. Astoria saw in Draco not the Death Eater or the bully, but the young man who had chosen mercy when it mattered, who was struggling genuinely to become better than he had been. When Draco proposed, it was without the formality and calculation that had marked every Malfoy engagement before. It was in the garden at sunset, with no prepared speech or grand gesture, just a simple question asked with genuine vulnerability. Will you marry me? Will you help me be better than I was? And Astoria, understanding everything that question truly asked, had said yes. They married in a small ceremony at the manor, nothing like the grand society weddings of previous Malfoy generations. The guest list was limited, family and a few close friends, people who genuinely wished them well rather than those attending for social advantage. Narcissa wept quietly during the ceremony, tears of relief that her son had found someone who might help him heal, who might break the cycle of pride and prejudice that had nearly destroyed them all. Lucius, his house arrest ended by then, watched his son's wedding with complex emotions. Pride, certainly, that the Malfoy line would continue, but also something like regret, recognition that Draco was choosing a different path, that the beliefs Lucius had tried to instill were being consciously rejected. It was difficult for Lucius to accept this, to watch his son become something he himself had never managed to be. But he tried, in his way, to give his blessing, to accept that perhaps this was how the family survived, by changing, by becoming something new. When Astoria became pregnant, the news brought joy mixed with trepidation. A new generation, a new Malfoy heir, another chance to get things right, or to repeat old mistakes. Narcissa felt the weight of this particularly acutely. She had raised Draco with love, but also with all the prejudices of her family. And look how that had turned out. What would this new child be taught? What beliefs would shape their understanding of the world? Draco and Astoria talked long into the night about this, about what values they wanted to pass to their child. They agreed that they would teach their son, for it was a son the healers confirmed, about his heritage, about the Malfoy family's long history. But they would also teach him that blood status did not determine worth, that magical ability could come from any source, that the old ways were not always the right ways. They would name him Scorpius, a star name, fitting for the black family tradition that Narcissa had brought to her marriage, and they would raise him to be proud of who he was without needing to feel superior to others. Scorpius Hyperion Malfoy was born on a winter morning when frost painted the manor's windows with crystal patterns and the gardens lay silent under a blanket of fresh snow. He came into the world in the same bedroom where Draco had been born, where Lucius before him, where generations of Malfoy heirs had drawn their first breaths. But the atmosphere surrounding his birth was different from all those that had come before, softer, warmer, touched with genuine joy rather than aristocratic satisfaction. Draco held his son for the first time, with hands that trembled slightly, looking down at the small face with its wisps of pale hair, and felt something shift fundamentally in his chest. This was not an heir, not a continuation of family legacy, not a vessel for ideology. This was a person, small and vulnerable and perfect, who deserved to grow up without the burdens that had been placed on Draco's own shoulders. "Hello, Scorpius," he whispered, and the baby's eyes, grey like his father's, like his grandfather's, like all the Malfoy eyes stretching back through centuries, blinked open and seemed to look directly at him. Astoria, exhausted but radiant in the way of new mothers, watched her husband with their son and felt her heart swell. She had been unsure when Draco first proposed whether the Malfoy family could truly change, whether the weight of their history would prove too heavy to escape. But watching Draco with Scorpius, seeing the pure love in his expression untainted by thoughts of legacy or expectation, she allowed herself to hope. Narcissa, holding her grandson later that day, felt tears slip down her cheeks. Something the old Narcissa would never have permitted, would have seen as weakness. She looked at this new life, this new chance, and made silent promises. She would be a better grandmother than she had been a mother. She would tell Scorpius stories of his family, yes, but honest stories that included the mistakes as well as the triumphs. She would love him without conditions, without expectations that he be anything other than himself. Even Lucius, standing at the edge of the room with his characteristic reserve, felt something stir in his carefully guarded heart. He looked at his grandson, the continuation of the Malfoy line, the future of the family name. And for perhaps the first time in his life, he questioned the wisdom of the beliefs he had passed to his son. What if they had been wrong? What if all that pride, all that certainty had led them not toward greatness, but toward the edge of destruction? The thoughts were uncomfortable, almost painful, but he could not entirely dismiss them. Scorpius grew up in a manner transformed. The house was lighter now, both literally and metaphorically. Curtains that had been kept drawn for generations were open to let in sunlight. Rooms that had been dark and forbidding were redecorated in warmer colors. The portraits of ancestors still hung on the walls, but their commentary was no longer accepted as absolute truth. When they offered advice steeped in old prejudices, Draco would politely disagree, teaching his son that respecting one's heritage did not mean being bound by its limitations. The house elves who remained, and there were fewer now by choice, were treated with a respect that would have shocked earlier generations of Malfoys. Scorpius grew up saying please and thank you to them, learning their names, understanding that service did not mean servitude, that magical creatures deserved dignity regardless of their station. When he asked why the elf portraits weren't hung in the family gallery like the human ones, Draco had no good answer except, because that's how it's always been done. And in that moment, father and son looked at each other and understood that tradition alone was not sufficient justification. Astoria's influence on the household was profound and gentle. She filled the manor with music. A piano appeared in the drawing room, and often in the evenings the sound of Chopin or Debussy would drift through corridors that had known mostly silence or stern conversation. She planted new sections in the gardens, flowers chosen for beauty rather than magical properties, areas where Scorpius could play freely without constant supervision. She invited families to visit, not just purebloods, but visiting families of all backgrounds, including some whose parents had fought against Voldemort, whose presence in Malfoy Manor would once have been unthinkable. These gatherings were initially awkward. Old wounds did not heal quickly, and many in the wizarding community remained suspicious of the Malfoys, uncertain whether their transformation was genuine or merely strategic. But Astoria persisted with patient grace, and slowly, tentatively, some barriers began to lower. People who came expecting cold aristocratic condescension found instead genuine hospitality, honest conversation, and a family clearly struggling to be better than their reputation suggested. Scorpius's childhood was nothing like Draco's had been. Where Draco had been raised in isolation and formality, taught that he was inherently superior, groomed for power and influence, Scorpius was raised with warmth and openness, taught that he was valuable not because of his bloodline, but because of who he chose to be. He played with children from various backgrounds, pure blood, half-blood, even muggle-born, and his parents encouraged these friendships rather than forbidding them. He learned magic, of course, showing the same early aptitude that had marked Malfoy children for generations. But when his accidental magic first manifested, transforming his mother's teacup into a small bird that flew around the breakfast room, the response was delight rather than satisfied pride. "Look what you did," Astoria exclaimed, laughing as the bird landed on Scorpius's shoulder. "Isn't magic wonderful? Not you have power, as you should, but simply joy in the wonder of magical ability." His education before Hogwarts included tutors, as was traditional, but the curriculum was broader than what previous Malfoy heirs had studied. He learned magical history, yes, but from multiple perspectives, not just the pure blood narrative. He learned about Muggle technology and culture, understanding that the non-magical world was different rather than inferior. He learned languages and music and art, subjects that had no practical application for power or influence, but simply expanded his understanding of beauty and human achievement. Most importantly, he learned about his family's history, the real history, not a sanitized version. Draco and Astoria believed their son deserved to know the truth, difficult as it was to tell. They explained about the dark mark on Draco's arm, about the choices his grandfather had made, about the beliefs that had nearly destroyed everything. These conversations were painful, especially for Draco, who had to confront his own past actions in explaining them to his son. "I was taught to believe terrible things," Draco told Scorpius one evening in the library when his son was old enough to understand, and I believed them, because everyone I trusted told me they were true. "I hurt people, Scorpius. I stood by while worse things happened. I'm not telling you this to make excuses, but to help you understand that what we're taught isn't always right, that we have to think for ourselves, that we have to question even the people we love." Scorpius, listening with wide grey eyes, had asked the question that pierced his father's heart. "Are you a bad person?" Draco had been silent for a long moment, then answered with careful honesty. "I was. I did bad things. I'm trying to be better now. That's all any of us can do. Recognize when we're wrong and try to be better." The letter from Hogwarts arrived on Scorpius's 11th birthday, and the family's reaction was complex. Pride, certainly, that the tradition continued, that another Malfoy would walk those ancient corridors, but also anxiety. Hogwarts held so many memories for Draco, not all of them pleasant, and he worried about what his son would face there, whether the Malfoy name would be burden or blessing. The trip to Diagon Alley was bittersweet for Draco. He walked those familiar cobblestone streets with Scorpius beside him, remembering his own first visit with his father, how Lucius had strode through the crowds with aristocratic confidence, how Draco had felt so proud and special. Now he walked with his hand on his son's shoulder, offering guidance rather than commands, encouraging questions rather than imposing answers. At Ollivander's, still run by the same family after all these years, Scorpius was presented with wand after wand, until finally one chose him. 11 inches, hazel and phoenix feather, surprisingly unyielding. Mr. Ollivander examined the boy with those same unsettling pale eyes that had assessed generations of young wizards. "Interesting," he murmured. "Phoenix feather wands are capable of the greatest range of magic, though they may take longer than others to reveal their true natures. Not unlike their wizards, perhaps." The journey to Hogwarts on the Hogwarts Express was one of the most difficult moments of Draco's life. Standing on platform 9 3/4, watching his son prepare to board the train, Draco felt himself transported back to his own first journey, remembered the certainty and pride he had felt, remembered how wrong he had been about so many things. He pulled Scorpius aside, away from Astoria and the crowds, and said something his own father had never said. "Scorpius, whatever house you're sorted into, we'll be proud of you. You understand? Whatever house. The Sorting Hat's decision doesn't define who you are or who you can become." But when the Sorting Hat was placed on Scorpius's head, it barely hesitated before calling Slytherin, just as it had for every Malfoy before him. Scorpius walked to the Slytherin table, his heart pounding, and found himself sitting beside Albus Severus Potter, Harry Potter's son, the boy from the Muggle-born mother, the one person his father had specifically hoped he would meet. Their friendship began tentatively, two boys carrying the weight of their families' histories, trying to figure out how to be themselves rather than echoes of their father's rivalry. Albus, sorted into Slytherin, despite his family's Gryffindor tradition, felt out of place and uncertain. Scorpius, despite being exactly where Malfoys had always been, also felt the weight of expectation and history. They found in each other unexpected understanding, and slowly, carefully, they became friends. This friendship, when Draco learned of it, moved him more than he could express. His son had chosen to befriend a Potter, had looked past family history and blood status to find genuine connection. It was everything Draco had hoped for, everything he had tried to raise Scorpius to be capable of. But seeing it actually happen felt like redemption. Not for Draco himself, perhaps, but for the family name, for the possibility that the future might be different from the past. The years of Scorpius's time at Hogwarts passed more peacefully than Draco's had. There were challenges, certainly. Some students still viewed the Malfoy name with suspicion. Some parents objected to their children associating with the family that had supported Voldemort. But Scorpius navigated these challenges with a grace his father had never possessed, neither hiding his heritage nor being defined by it, treating everyone with the respect Draco had once reserved only for those he considered his equals. Back at the manor, changes continued. Lucius, in his final years, softened in ways that surprised everyone. He began having long conversations with his grandson during school holidays, talks in the library where for once he listened more than he lectured. He told Scorpius stories of the family's history, but honest stories now, including his own failures and regrets. "We were wrong about many things," he admitted one evening, his voice carrying the weight of age and accumulated sorrow. "We believed our blood made us superior, and that belief led us into darkness. Don't make the same mistakes, Scorpius. Pride is a dangerous master. When Lucius passed away peacefully in his sleep at the age of 83, the funeral was a strange mixture of old and new traditions. Pure-blood families attended, but so did others. People the old Lucius would never have welcomed, but whom the family invited because they had been part of the manor's transformation, part of the slow healing that had followed the war. Harry Potter attended, standing at the back of the gathering, and when Draco caught his eye, they exchanged a nod of mutual respect. Not friendship, perhaps, but acknowledgement that they had both survived. Both tried to do better. Narcissa lived longer, seeing Scorpius graduate from Hogwarts, watching him choose his own path. Not in the ministry seeking power like his ancestors, but in magical research, studying ways to heal curse damage, to undo some of the harm dark magic had caused. She lived to see him fall in love with a young woman of mixed heritage, and when she heard of his engagement, she smiled and gave her blessing without hesitation. The old Narcissa would have objected to such a match, would have worried about bloodline and tradition. The woman she had become understood that love mattered more than lineage, that the family would survive not by maintaining purity, but by embracing change. The manor in these later years became something it had never been in all its long history, a place of genuine warmth and welcome. The dark artifacts that had filled the vaults were gone, donated to the ministry, or destroyed. The portraits of ancestors still hung on the walls, but their words were taken as historical curiosity other than moral guidance. The gardens bloomed with flowers chosen for beauty rather than magical properties, and the white peacocks, descendants of those that had strutted through the grounds for generations, still called their distinctive cries across manicured lawns. But the sound was no longer ominous, merely part of the manor's character. Draco, in his middle years, took on a project that would have shocked his younger self. He began writing a history of the Malfoy family, an honest accounting of their centuries of pride and prejudice, their achievements and their crimes. He did not try to justify what they had done or believed, did not make excuses for supporting Voldemort or looking down on those they considered inferior. He simply told the truth, believing that perhaps others could learn from the Malfoy story, could understand how good people, or at least people who believed themselves good, could be led into supporting terrible things. Every family has its shadows, he wrote in the introduction. The question is whether we deny those shadows or acknowledge them, whether we repeat the mistakes of our ancestors or learn from them. The Malfoy family has been many things over the centuries, wealthy and influential, proud and prejudiced, powerful and ultimately deeply flawed. We nearly destroyed ourselves in service to an ideology that promised greatness but delivered only horror. This is our story, told honestly, in the hope that honesty might be the first step toward earned redemption. Astoria, reading the manuscript, had wept, not from sadness, but from pride in the man her husband had become, from recognition of how far they had all traveled from where they began. She added her own chapter about what it meant to marry into the Malfoy family, to love someone carrying such complicated history, to believe in the possibility of change even when others doubted. Scorpius, reading his parents' work, understood finally the full weight of what he carried, not just a family name, but a legacy of both light and darkness, pride and prejudice, failure and the slow, difficult work of redemption. He added the final chapter himself, about growing up Malfoy in a world still healing from the war his family had helped to wage, about friendship with the Potter, about choosing to honor his heritage by being better than it, by proving that names do not define destiny. And so, dear listener, we come to the end of our tale. The Malfoy family, which began in Norman pride and accumulated wealth and power through centuries of careful calculation and unwavering belief in blood supremacy, which rose to the heights of influence and fell to the depths of complicity in terrible crimes, has found its way, finally, to something like wisdom. They are not perfect. Healing is not perfection, and change is not completion. Old habits of thought still surface sometimes. Old prejudices whisper in quiet moments. But they are trying, choosing day by day to be better than they were, to break cycles that ran unbroken for generations. The manor still stands in its Wiltshire estate, pale stone glowing in moonlight, gardens peaceful in the evening air. The portraits of ancestors watch from their frames, their painted eyes holding centuries of accumulated experience, both cautionary and instructive. The library's books still line their shelves, holding wisdom and prejudice in equal measure, available to those who can learn to distinguish between the two. The family name continues, carried forward by those who understand that legacy is not just what we inherit, but what we choose to do with that inheritance. In this transformation, dear listener, we find a message of hope, that no family is beyond redemption, that no history is so dark that light cannot eventually find its way in, that pride, when tempered with humility and wisdom, can become not a source of prejudice, but of genuine self-respect. The Malfoys learn, slowly and painfully, what many must learn. The true strength lies not in domination, but in growth, not in maintaining superiority, but in accepting equality, not in clinging to the past, but in building something better for the future. Sleep now, dear listener, with images of the manor at peace, Scorpius and Albus walking through its gardens, friendship bridging old divides, Draco and Astoria sitting by firelight, hands intertwined, having built something good from difficult foundations, Narcissa in her final years, content in the knowledge that her family had survived and changed, the portraits of ancestors watching as the family they created becomes something they could never have imagined, something arguably better than they were. The story of the Malfoy family is complete, but stories never truly end. They continue in those who hear them, in the lessons they carry, in the understanding they provide. May you carry from this tale whatever serves you, the warning against pride unchecked, the possibility of change even from difficult beginnings, the understanding that we are all more than our worst moments, that redemption is always possible for those willing to do the work. Rest now, dear listener. Let sleep embrace you gently. Let dreams carry you to peaceful places. The manor's candles are dimming, the garden settling into night's embrace, the long story finding its natural conclusion. You have journeyed with the Malfoys through centuries of pride and prejudice, darkness and dawning light. Now let their story settle softly into your mind. Let its lessons rest gently in your heart, and let sleep come naturally, peacefully, completely. Good night, dear listener. Thank you for walking this long path with me, through shadow and into light. May your rest be deep and your dreams be kind. The story is told, the tale complete, and now there is only sleep, blessed sleep, carrying you toward tomorrow. Good night.